Hello, YouTube, Internet, world. Welcome back to another episode of Dime Store Cinema, the show in which I watch movies, I give you my 2 cents, so you can decide if it's worth your dime. Let's talk movies. Today, I want to talk about John Wick 2. Now, once again, this is another movie that's been out not for a whole long time, but for a little while, long enough for most people to have seen it. And so this is, once again, much more of a discussion piece. Once again, more playing towards some of my friends who might or might not have seen the movie. So I believe it's on one of the streaming sites. I think it's HBO, if I remember correctly. So if you have a subscription to HBO, it's available for you to watch. So starting off, I want to say that I really like Keanu Reeves. His acting has been spotty. I think of particularly Dracula. He was definitely miscast in that movie. I don't know who their casting director was, but they messed up. He was not right for the part. It was a fine movie overall, but his accent was bad. And there were a few other missteps in his career, and a lot of people make fun of his acting choices. But I mean, personally, I always like his likable characters, regardless. And, you know, as far as entertainment value goes, I find him to be very entertaining. So, say what you will about the man. I like him. I think that his what little we know about his personal life is interesting. I find him to be a very hardworking person who's focused and dedicated. And I'm glad that he is or has been more focused on action movies lately, because that, I think, is his strong point. Mainly because his ability to emote wavers, and you know, I think that's fine. I mean, you know, depending on what type of movies you want to be in and what type of actor you want to be. All that being said, though, John Wick 2, I've heard a lot of people go back and forth. I think a lot of people, their first viewing, they said that it was really good and they liked it better than the first, but I think on multiple viewings, a lot of people just kind of decided that no, it wasn't as good, it was just more action. And I mean, that is definitely true. There is a lot more action in this movie. It's pretty much nonstop from start to finish. I'm pretty sure they were going for something like Raid or Raid 2. I think that was, I don't know, but I'm assuming that was a major inspiration. So I think that the action was pretty good. And a lot of people are complaining that it was a bit repetitive. A lot of the same moves done over and over again. And while that is somewhat true, there were slight variations in the moves if you're actually paying attention to it, that set them apart from one another. So there was a little bit of difference. My bigger problem with it wasn't so much the moves, but just in an effort to provide the wide angle, see everything action. It became very apparent that we were viewing choreographed fighting. And not to say that the moves weren't done correctly, it was that the moves were done too slowly. So you have instances where he's putting people in arm locks and other things like that, and there's a big pause while there's a wind up for either a headshot or a punch in the face. And so there's this pause in between the actual movements, and that's characteristic of stage fighting, because the bad guy who's getting the lock on his arm or neck has to stay immobile so that the action can follow through. You know, you don't want to throw an unexpected fist to the star's face, which is what probably would have happened in a real fight. So it was the timing, and whereas I don't like highly edited fight scenes, I think this could have served from a little bit of editing, just because of that pace. And you know, when you're going for realism in a film, I understand that, but you have to understand that when you're doing these types of moves that can legitimately break people's arms and back, you can't be too real, because it either leads to what happens here, where there has to be that pause while movements catch up with the action, or you have to edit it in a way that it appears to be seamless. And I think that was one of the biggest problems I had with the action in this movie. There were those pauses in the action, and so that kind of threw me out of the action a little bit. And I mean, that's not to say that it wasn't visually spectacular, because it was a lot of fun to watch. And I don't want to give the impression that this is a bad film. It's just, particularly when you're dealing with mindless action film, it's not bad in that regard, but it's not as good as the first one, because the first one, I think it did better with with what I was saying with the pauses in action. I don't think there were as many, or it wasn't as noticeable at least. And then also, and I think more importantly, because I'm a story person, I love stories, I think the story was much better in the first one, because the story was actually just a straightforward story. It was a narrative from start to finish. It was a series of cause and effect. This happened, which caused this to happen, which caused this to happen, which caused this to get resolved. Whereas in this movie, you have a whole first act, and it kind of reminded me of a Bond film in this regard. You had a whole first act where he gets his car back, which was, one of the things in the first movie. So you had this whole action set piece that then had little to nothing to do with the rest of the film. So you had this one plot point, I guess, to resolve the first movie, even though I thought the first movie was resolved perfectly fine. But you had this one chunk at the beginning of the movie that quote unquote resolves the first movie. And then you get into the narrative of the movie. So you have this disjointed section in the movie that kind of throws things off a little bit. And so that was an issue for me as far as storytelling goes. I don't think it was done well. With the James Bond movies, it's a little different, because the James Bond movies, at least particularly the older ones, they kind of became parodies of themselves. Not comically parodies, but they all had a narrative structure that was very predictable. And that's what was a characteristic for the Bond films that made them Bond films and created a nostalgic and comforting feeling when watching them. This movie is in no way a Bond film, but it's trying to have that similar narrative structure where you have the beginning action set piece, and then you get into the actual narrative. And it didn't work with this movie, particularly because this movie is a non-stop action movie. So it should have been a strictly linear timeline because of how action-packed it was. It should have just started and just gone through, instead of starting, stopping, and then starting again. I think that ruined the flow of the movie. I think that it weakened the narrative structure, and that was a big problem. Those are my two main criticisms. Everything else I think was fine. I like that they were expanding the underground assassins world. I liked how they did it and how they made this their own economic system, and they had these rules, and I really liked how they expanded on all of those things. I thought it was great. I thought it was a lot of fun. I thought that it really helped the viewer to understand just how badass Keanu Reeves' character actually is. Because you have this whole centralized network. All of them know who he is. All of them are afraid of him. Some of them try to kill him. all of them die trying, and then there's just there's enough respect for him that the leaders, as it were, provide him a fairly wide berth when they gave, they give him a lot of leeway, even though he's breaking all of the rules, and so it was very interesting to see just how badass he must have been based on just seeing this whole world open up. And yeah, so it was a good movie, and there's not really anything to get into as far as like deeper meanings or metaphor or any of that kind of stuff. It was a straightforward action film, and I think one of the other things that makes this a little weaker than the original was the fact that the original was a classical narrative structure. It was a revenge movie. This one isn't a revenge movie. It's just a straight-up action piece. It's John Wick fighting for his life, essentially. And I guess fighting for honor, I guess you could kind of say. So it's kind of trying to tie into maybe like a classic samurai film, or a shogun film, something like that. It's tying into that, and I can see how those two things are similar, and how they kind of follow a similar idea. It's just it doesn't. I don't think it had the same impact as the first one, particularly I think in the West. Like here in America, our idea of honor is much different than an Eastern idea of honor, or at least it used to be. I can't speak for Eastern culture, really, but I know and I can't even say I know anything of ancient Eastern culture except for what is presented in their narratives, their stories. And in their stories, particularly movies, even going back as far as Seven Samurai and even before that, their idea of honor is much different than the American view of honor. So I think that maybe in that case, it might play pretty well, maybe a little better in places like Japan and China. I could be completely wrong, and I am not a person who claims to know a particularly large amount about other cultures, but once again, just from the films that I have seen, the ideas were presented in a way that seemed to be more in keeping with that. Whereas in the first movie, like I said, it's a revenge film, and that's something that American culture really understands, and it really resonates with our culture. And once again, I think even like particularly there are some Korean films that I've seen where revenge plots are much better than anything in America, so I know they understand this too. But once again, it's a slightly different perspective. There's a difference between, say, a Clint Eastwood revenge film and a Chan-wook Park revenge film, like Old Boy or Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance or Lady Vengeance. That type of revenge story is slightly different. Whereas in the original John Wick movie, the revenge is straightforward, it's understandable, you're on his side, you know why he's doing it, you sympathize, you empathize, and you want him to succeed. In this movie, you want all those things too, but it's not as emotionally significant, I guess I should say. And so I think that kind of hurt the narrative structure as well. But once again, I think they were going for something different, though. They were trying to do a nonstop action set piece, just one set piece to another. And they did that. But I've already issued my concerns for the way that the action was filmed, and I've already issued my concerns with the narrative structure. So, be that as it may, I enjoyed watching it. I had a great time watching it. I just happened to notice a couple things that I didn't think were as strong as the first movie. And, maybe you shouldn't necessarily compare one to the other. So, there's that. If you're just looking at this movie and not comparing it to any other movie, then I think you'll have a great time, and I don't think you don't have to measure it up to the first one if you don't want to. It's just, for me, it's hard not to. From the way this is set up, I think it would be a really good trilogy. I want them to make one more movie where there's an actual resolution to everything. And I think that might be good, because this movie kind of felt like a middle movie, where a lot of times there's that lull and things are a little different. So I would kind of like to see another movie have a trilogy. I'm a big fan of trilogies. I very rarely like it when they make more than 3 movies. I think a 3-act structure is a really, really good structure. I think it's solid. I think it's been proven by time, and there's something about that 3-act structure that I think is really good, and so I'm hoping they make another one. So that should speak a little bit to what how I like this movie. I'm not saying that it ruined the franchise. I'm not saying that it was really, really bad. Just a few concerns. You might not even notice them. You'll have to watch it and find out. And I suggest it. I think you should. If I were to rate it, I'd probably give it maybe a C+, a B. But I rate somewhat harshly most of the time. When I say C, I genuinely mean average. So there are a lot of movies that I think some people would rate much higher than that. But I consider them to be average movies, even if they're particularly entertaining. And that's one of my curses for being a little too literal when I when I use grading systems or words in general. But in any case, I hope that if you do watch it, you enjoy it. If you don't, that's perfectly fine. Once again, this is more of a discussion piece, because I know a lot of people have already seen it. Most of the people who want to see it have already seen it, and it's available on, I believe it's HBO. So more of a discussion piece. I look forward to talking to anyone who wants to talk about it, their ideas, what they think about the structure, what they think about the action. So I look forward to any discussion that this might bring. And once again, thank you all for watching. Please please subscribe if you're into this kind of thing, and I will talk to you all later. Bye-bye.